They found Thomas Reed's body 3 days after the storm cleared, less than half a mile from his cabin, frozen in a sitting position against a tree, his rifle across his lap, facing the wrong direction. The tracks he had been following were long gone, erased by the same snow that had taken his sense of direction and then his life. He had walked in circles through the woods he had known for 15 years, each loop bringing him closer to exhaustion and farther from the understanding that he was lost. Welcome to this journey through one of the most disorienting pursuits ever documented in the Ozark wilderness. In the years when tracking game through winter woods was a necessary skill for survival, when a hunter's ability to follow sign and maintain direction could mean the difference between feeding his family and going hungry, when the snow that made tracking possible could also become the mechanism that erased every landmark and every trail, there lived a man who followed tracks deeper into falling snow than judgment should have allowed, who pursued game beyond the point where return was certain, and who discovered too late that the same conditions that created clear tracks could erase them completely, leaving him in a white wilderness where every direction looked the same, and where the cabin that sat less than half a mile away might as well have been on the other side of the world, for all the good that proximity did him, when he could not determine which direction would lead him home. Comment where you're watching from as we trace the line between pursuit and loss, between following tracks and becoming lost ourselves. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we follow Thomas into those woods and watch the snow erase his way home, consider what tracking meant on the frontier and why the ability to follow sign while maintaining orientation was understood to be the difference between successful hunting and fatal disorientation. Tracking was not just about reading marks in snow or soil. It was about maintaining constant awareness of position relative to known landmarks, about building a mental map of the route traveled so that return would be possible even if tracks were obscured, about recognizing when pursuit had extended so far or into such difficult terrain that continuing forward was less wise than turning back, while the way home remained clear. Experienced hunters understood that tracks were temporary, that weather could erase them, that snow could obscure landmarks, and that the excitement of pursuit could override the judgment that said, "You have gone far enough. Turn back now while you still know the way." The wilderness did not care about a hunter's determination, or his need for meat, or his confidence in his ability to find his way. It simply presented conditions that either allowed navigation or prevented it, and the difference between the two could change within minutes, when falling snow transformed a landscape where direction was obvious into a landscape where every tree looked identical, and where the sun's position was hidden behind clouds that offered no guidance about which way led home, and which way led deeper into woods that would kill anyone who stayed in them. Once darkness and cold combined to make survival impossible. Thomas Reed was 39 years old in the winter of 1897, married to Catherine for 16 years, father to 4 children aged 14, 12, 9, and 6. He had lived on his homestead in the Ozark woods approximately 8 miles south of what would eventually become West Plains, Missouri, since 1882, and was known as a capable hunter who provided meat for his family through the cold months when fresh game was the difference between adequate nutrition and the slow deterioration that inadequate food created over a winter of confinement and cold. The winter of 1896-1897 had been difficult. Heavy snows in December had created good tracking conditions, but had also made travel difficult and had kept game movement limited. By late January, the Reed family's meat supply was lower than Thomas would have preferred, and the prospect of several more weeks of winter without adequate protein was concerning enough that Thomas was willing to hunt in conditions that were less than ideal, to pursue game farther than he might normally go, and to take risks that better circumstances would have advised against. January 28, 1897, began with light snow falling, perhaps an inch of new accumulation on top of the 8 or 10 inches that already covered the ground from previous storms. Thomas left his cabin mid-morning, carrying his rifle and basic supplies, intending to check areas where he knew deer sometimes bedded during daytime hours and hoping to find fresh tracks that would indicate recent movement, and that would allow him to locate and harvest an animal that would extend his family's meat supply through the remainder of winter. The hunting territory Thomas intended to cover was familiar. He had hunted these woods for 15 years, knew the ridges and hollows, knew where game trails ran, and where deer were likely to be found during different weather conditions. His plan was to work a circuit that would take him perhaps 2 miles from the cabin at its farthest point, covering ground that he could traverse in good conditions in a few hours, allowing him to return home by mid-afternoon, with or without having taken game. But plans made in morning conditions can become irrelevant when conditions change, when the light snow that seemed manageable intensifies into heavy snowfall that reduces visibility and obscures trails, when pursuit of game leads farther than intended because tracks remain clear and fresh, and the opportunity to harvest meat is too valuable to abandon easily, and when the excitement of following sign makes it difficult to maintain constant awareness of position and direction, and of the accumulating distance that must eventually be reversed to reach home, before darkness makes navigation impossible. Thomas found fresh deer tracks approximately a mile from his cabin, clear prints in the new snow indicating that an animal had passed through within the past hour or two. The tracks led east, up a gradual slope toward a ridge that Thomas knew held bedding areas where deer rested during midday hours. Following the tracks would take him farther from the cabin than he had planned to go, but the tracks were fresh enough that the deer was likely nearby, and the value of meat justified extending the hunt beyond the original intended range. He followed the tracks up the slope, moving carefully to avoid making noise that would alert the deer to his presence. The snow was falling more heavily now than it had been when he left the cabin, perhaps an inch per hour rather than the light dusting that had been falling earlier, but visibility remained adequate. The tracks remained clear, and Thomas's focus was on the pursuit, rather than on the weather that was making pursuit possible, while also creating conditions that would eventually become dangerous. The tracks led over the ridge and down into a hollow on the far side, terrain that Thomas knew, but that was farther from his cabin than he typically hunted. He was now perhaps 1.5 miles from home, having followed the deer's trail for half a mile beyond his cabin and then another mile up and over the ridge. The return journey would require climbing back over the ridge, a physical effort that would be more difficult after the exertion of pursuit. But Thomas's confidence in his knowledge of the area and in his ability to retrace his route made the distance seem manageable. In the hollow, the tracks showed where the deer had paused, had moved in a zigzag pattern, suggesting it was browsing rather than traveling purposefully, indicating that the animal was nearby and that Thomas was close to an opportunity to shoot. He moved forward slowly, scanning the woods ahead, looking for the shape of the deer among the trees and the falling snow that was now heavy enough to reduce visibility to perhaps 100 yards. He saw movement, a flicker of brown among the white and gray of the winter forest. The deer was there, perhaps 70 yards ahead, partially obscured by trees but visible enough to offer a shot. Thomas raised his rifle, steadied his aim, and fired. The deer bolted at the sound, crashing through brush and disappearing into the heavy snowfall before Thomas could determine whether his shot had hit or missed. He walked forward to where the deer had been standing, looking for blood in the snow that would indicate a hit, and that would allow him to follow a blood trail to recover the animal. But he found no blood. The snow where the deer had stood was unmarked, except by its tracks leading away, suggesting that his shot had missed or had failed to penetrate deeply enough to cause bleeding. Thomas faced a decision. The deer was wounded, or had been missed, had run deeper into the hollow away from the direction of his cabin, and following it would take him even farther from home into terrain that was less familiar and in weather that was deteriorating. The responsible choice was to turn back, to accept that this hunt had not succeeded, and to return home while he still knew clearly which direction home was and while visibility remained adequate to navigate by landmarks. But the excitement of pursuit, the value of potential meat, and the possibility that the deer was wounded and needed to be followed to prevent suffering and waste all combined to override the judgment that said, "Turn back." Thomas followed the deer's running tracks deeper into the hollow, moving faster now because running animals create obvious trails, and because wounded deer often run only a short distance before slowing or stopping, offering another opportunity to shoot. He followed for another quarter-mile, the tracks remaining clear in the fresh snow, before they led up a side drainage and over a small ridge into an adjacent hollow that Thomas did not recognize immediately. He was now approximately 2 miles from his cabin, having pursued the deer much farther than he had intended, into terrain that was familiar in general, but not specifically known in the way his immediate hunting territory was known. The tracks showed where the deer had slowed, had stopped, and then had resumed moving, but at a walk rather than a run. Thomas continued following, still convinced that the animal was wounded, and that he was close to finding it. The snow was falling heavily enough now that visibility was reduced to perhaps 50 yards, and the accumulation on the ground was creating conditions where his own tracks behind him were beginning to fill in. The boot prints he had made 15 or 20 minutes earlier already softened and partially obscured by new snow. Another quarter-mile of following brought him to where the deer's tracks disappeared into a dense thicket of brush and small trees that would be difficult to move through quietly, and that would make shooting almost impossible if the deer was bedded inside. Thomas paused, finally allowing himself to assess the situation fully. He was approximately 2¼ miles from his cabin, had been following the deer for over an hour, was in terrain he did not know intimately, and the snowfall had intensified to the point where visibility was severely limited, and where his own tracks, back the way he had come, were being erased almost as fast as he made them. This was the moment when judgment should have overcome pursuit, when the value of meat should have been weighed against the risk of becoming disoriented in deteriorating conditions, when the wise choice would have been to abandon the deer and focus entirely on returning home while return was still possible. Thomas stood at the edge of the thicket, looking at the tracks disappearing into dense cover, and made the calculation that many hunters have made when pursuit has carried them too far. One more attempt, one more push into the thicket to see if the deer was there, and then he would turn back regardless of whether he found the animal or not. He entered the thicket, pushing through branches that caught on his clothing and that dumped accumulated snow onto him as he passed, following the tracks that were still visible in the protected space under the dense canopy. The thicket was perhaps 50 yards across, and halfway through it Thomas found where the deer had bedded briefly, the depression in the snow showing where the animal had lain for several minutes before rising and moving on. But there was still no blood, still no indication that the deer was wounded enough to prevent it from continuing to move. Thomas emerged from the far side of the thicket into a small clearing and stopped. The deer's tracks continued across the clearing and into more woods beyond, but Thomas had reached the limit of reasonable pursuit. He had followed the animal more than 2 miles from his cabin, had pushed into terrain he, did not know well and had allowed the pursuit to carry him forward while snow and weather deteriorated around him. The deer was not wounded, was capable of continuing to move indefinitely, and following it farther would be foolish when he had already committed errors of judgment that had brought him to a point where returning home was going to require careful navigation and sustained effort. He turned to retrace his route, intending to follow his own tracks back through the thicket, across the hollow, over the ridge, and eventually back to familiar territory and to his cabin. But when he looked at the ground behind him, he saw that his tracks through the clearing were already partially filled with new snow, the boot prints that he had made minutes earlier, softened and indistinct. Still visible, but not with the clarity that confident backtracking required. This was the moment when concern became fear, when Thomas realized that the snow that had made tracking the deer possible was now erasing his way home, that the conditions he had ignored while focused on pursuit had deteriorated to the point where navigating back would not be simple. Retracing of clear tracks, but would require maintaining direction and finding landmarks in a landscape where visibility was limited, and where every tree looked similar through the falling snow. He entered the thicket again, moving back through the dense brush, trying to follow the route he had taken coming in, but finding that the tracks were obscured by the snow that had fallen from branches as he had disturbed them, and by the dim light under the thick canopy that made it difficult to see marks in the snow clearly. He emerged on the far side of the thicket, or what he believed was the far side, and found himself in woods that looked similar to where he had entered, but that were not precisely the same, suggesting that he had not followed the exact route through the thicket and that he was now slightly off his intended path. This slight deviation would not have mattered in good visibility or with clear tracks to follow, but in heavy snow with limited visibility and with tracks that were filling in rapidly, even small navigation errors could compound into serious disorientation. Thomas tried to orient himself by the slope of the ground, knowing that he needed to travel, generally west and upslope to reach the ridge he had crossed earlier, but the terrain in this area was broken and irregular, with multiple small ridges and drainages that created confusing topography. He walked west, or what he believed was west, climbing a slope that he thought would take him to the ridge he had crossed. But when he reached the top of the slope, he found himself not on a ridge with a view across the hollow beyond, but on a small rise that was surrounded by more woods, and that offered no clear indication of which direction would lead to the terrain he recognized. Thomas stopped and tried to think methodically. He knew the general direction of his cabin, west from where he had been pursuing the deer. He knew he needed to cross a ridge and descend into a hollow and then climb another slope to reach the area around his cabin. But knowing general directions was different from being able to navigate precisely when landmarks were obscured and when the falling snow made it impossible to see more than 50 yards in any direction. He continued west, descending a slope into what he thought was the hollow he needed to cross. But the hollow seemed too narrow, and the slope on the far side seemed wrong, not steep enough, not positioned the way he remembered the terrain he had crossed earlier. He climbed the far slope anyway, hoping that reaching higher ground would provide better visibility or would reveal landmarks he recognized. But the top of the slope offered only more woods and more falling snow and no clear indication that he was on the right path. Thomas realized with growing dread that he was lost, not catastrophically disoriented, not unable to determine any direction, but sufficiently uncertain of his position that he could not confidently navigate back to his cabin without the possibility of walking in the wrong direction and making his situation worse. He had been hunting these woods for 15 years, knew the general area well, but the specific hollow and ridge he was trying to find were obscured by snow, and similarity, by the way that winter forest looked uniform when visibility was limited and when the unique features of individual locations were hidden under white, that made every ridge and every hollow look functionally identical. What Catherine Reed knew, standing at the window of their cabin as afternoon turned toward evening, was that Thomas was late. He had left mid-morning with plans to return by mid-afternoon, and the sun was now low in the sky, or would have been visible if the heavy snow had not obscured it, and there was no sign of him returning. Catherine knew Thomas was an experienced hunter, knew he understood the woods and the weather, but she also knew that the snowfall had intensified throughout the day, and that conditions outside were becoming dangerous for anyone who was not in shelter. She fed the children their evening meal, maintaining calm and routine while trying to suppress her growing worry. Thomas had been late before, had stayed out longer than planned when tracking took him farther than expected, but he had always returned before dark because he knew the danger of trying to navigate unfamiliar terrain in darkness and in winter conditions. That he was not yet home as darkness approached suggested that something had gone wrong, not necessarily catastrophic, but wrong enough that his return was delayed beyond what planning and experience should have allowed. Catherine considered whether she should attempt to go looking for Thomas, but she knew that doing so would risk leaving the children without both parents, would require navigating in darkness and in heavy snow, and would have very little chance of actually locating Thomas in woods that covered many square miles. The responsible choice was to stay with the children, to maintain the fire and the cabin as a landmark that Thomas would find if he was trying to return, and to hope that his delay was due to caution rather than crisis, that he had recognized the conditions were too dangerous to risk traveling, and had found shelter to wait out the snow before attempting to return home. But as the hours passed, and darkness became complete, and the snow continued to fall heavily enough that several more inches had accumulated since Thomas had left, Catherine had to acknowledge that Thomas was in serious danger. If he was lost in these conditions, if he had become disoriented, trying to navigate back through woods where tracks were erased and landmarks were obscured, then he was exposed to cold and snow and exhaustion that could kill him before morning if he did not find shelter, or if he exhausted himself, wandering in search of a cabin that he might walk within yards of without seeing through the darkness and the falling snow. The nearest neighbors, the Morrison family, lived approximately 2 miles distant. Catherine could not leave the children to go seek help, could not risk traveling at night in these conditions, and could only wait and hope and maintain the fire and the lights that might serve as beacons, if Thomas was close enough to see them through the snow and the darkness. Thomas knew he was in crisis. The afternoon light was fading, darkness would come soon, and he had been walking for hours without finding terrain he recognized, or without crossing any landmark that would confirm he was traveling in the right direction. His tracks behind him were gone, erased by the continuing snowfall that had not slowed since morning, and every attempt to orient himself had led to more woods and more uncertainty. He tried multiple strategies. He attempted to follow drainages downhill, knowing that water flowed toward larger creeks, and that following watercourses would eventually lead to more open terrain where orientation might be easier. But the drainages in this area were small and branching, leading in multiple directions, and without clear knowledge of which creek system he was in. Following water was as likely to lead him farther from his cabin as toward it. He tried to climb to high points, hoping that elevation would provide views that would show him landmarks, or that would allow him to see lights from his cabin or from neighbors' cabins. But the ridges in this area were heavily forested, and the falling snow obscured any distant views, and the effort of climbing in deep snow was exhausting him rapidly, without providing the navigation information he needed. He tried to walk in straight lines, maintaining direction, by keeping trees aligned behind him, hoping that consistent direction would eventually lead him out of the area where he was lost and into terrain he recognized. But walking straight through dense forest in deep snow required constant detours around obstacles, and each detour meant losing the straight line and having to re-establish direction. And without sun or stars to confirm direction, he was navigating by guess and by hope, rather than by any reliable reference. As darkness fell completely, Thomas had to acknowledge that he was not going to reach his cabin that night, that he had become thoroughly lost despite 15 years of hunting these woods, and that survival now depended on finding shelter and maintaining warmth until morning, when daylight might allow him to navigate more effectively, or when searchers might be able to locate him. He found a large tree with low-hanging branches that provided some protection from the snow, and sat down with his back against the trunk, trying to conserve energy and to stay as warm as possible until morning. He was not dressed for spending a night outside. His clothing was adequate for a day of hunting, but was not the heavy layered protection that deliberate winter camping would require, and he knew that sitting still in temperatures that were probably in the low 20s would be dangerous, that hypothermia would become a risk within hours if he did not stay active enough to generate heat, but also did not exhaust himself so completely that his body could no longer function. He tried to stay awake, knowing that falling asleep in these conditions could be fatal, but exhaustion from hours of walking through deep snow and from the psychological stress of being lost made staying alert difficult. He dozed intermittently, waking when cold penetrated enough to overcome tiredness, then dozing again in cycles that made it impossible to track time or to know how many hours remained until dawn. The snow continued through the night. By morning, assuming Thomas could determine when morning had arrived without being able to see the sun, several additional inches had accumulated, and the woods were uniformly white, every surface covered with snow that obscured features and that made the landscape even more difficult to read than it had been the previous day. Thomas woke, or became more fully alert from the semi-conscious state he had maintained through the night, to gray light that indicated day had returned. He was cold to his core. His fingers and toes were numb, and his thoughts were slower and less clear than they should have been, indicating that hypothermia was affecting him despite his attempts to stay active and generate heat. He knew he needed to move, needed to walk and try again, to find his way home, needed to generate warmth through activity, because sitting still would allow the cold to progress to the point where action would become impossible. He stood, finding the movement difficult after sitting through the cold night, and tried to determine direction. The landscape gave him no clear information, no sun, no landmarks, no tracks, just uniform white woods that looked the same in every direction. He chose a direction that felt right based on instinct, and on some vague sense that the terrain looked slightly more familiar in that direction than in others, and he began walking. He walked for what felt like hours, but what may have been less time than his impaired judgment estimated. He crossed ridges and hollows that all looked similar, followed drainages that led nowhere recognizable, and found himself repeatedly in terrain that seemed like it should be familiar, but that refused to resolve into specific knowledge of location. The falling snow had stopped, which improved visibility slightly, but the uniformity of the white landscape and the absence of sun to provide directional reference made navigation almost impossible. By mid-morning of the second day, or what Thomas believed was mid-morning based on the light level, he was becoming aware that his physical condition was deteriorating seriously. Hypothermia was progressing, his movements were becoming less coordinated, and his thinking was becoming less clear. He knew intellectually that he was probably close to his cabin, that 2 miles of wandering in a relatively small area should have brought him across some recognizable feature, or should have led him to a road or a creek or some landmark that would orient him. But the intellectual knowledge did nothing to make the surrounding woods reveal their secrets, or to make direction apparent. He found another large tree and sat down again, needing to rest, needing to think, needing to make a plan that would be more effective than aimless wandering through woods that refused to give up their orientation. But rest allowed the cold to penetrate more deeply, and thinking was becoming difficult when his mind was affected by the hypothermia that was now clearly controlling his physical and mental state. Thomas sat against the tree, his rifle across his lap, facing a direction that he believed was toward his cabin, but that may have been any direction at all, and waited for either rescue or for the progression of cold to reach its inevitable conclusion. He was no longer capable of sustained movement, no longer able to generate the heat through activity that survival required, and had reached the state where hypothermia creates a kind of acceptance, a reduction in the urgency that should accompany life-threatening situations, a drift toward unconsciousness that feels almost peaceful when experienced from inside the failing body, even though from outside it represents the final stages of freezing to death. He remained in that position, sitting against the tree, rifle across his lap, facing outward toward woods that looked identical in every direction. As the afternoon progressed, and as the cold completed its work of shutting down the metabolic processes that maintained life. Death from hypothermia is not violent or sudden. It is a gradual cessation, a slow cooling that eventually reaches the point where the heart can no longer function and where consciousness fades into nothing, without dramatic final moments or clear awareness that the end has arrived. The search for Thomas began on the morning of January 29th, when it became clear that he had not returned overnight, and that his absence was not the result of deliberate decision to wait out the snow before traveling, but was the result of something having gone wrong during the hunt. Neighbors organized a search party, men who knew the woods and who knew Thomas's likely hunting territory, and they spread out to cover the area where he might have gone. They found his body on January 31st, 3 days after he had left his cabin, less than half a mile from home, in a direct line, though probably several miles from home, as he had walked through his disoriented wandering. He was sitting against a tree, frozen solid, his rifle across his lap, facing approximately north when his cabin was to the south. The tracks he had been following, the deer tracks that had led him into pursuit and then into disorientation, were gone, erased by the snow that had fallen during and after his hunt, leaving no evidence of the path he had followed or of the route that had seemed so clear when he had been making the decision to pursue farther than judgment recommended. The search party members reconstructed what they could of Thomas's final days. His tracks leaving the cabin on January 28th were long gone, but based on where his body was found and on knowledge of the terrain, they estimated that he had followed game over a ridge to the east, had pursued for a considerable distance, and then had become disoriented, trying to return when the snow erased his tracks and obscured landmarks. He had apparently wandered through the woods for more than a day, had spent at least one night outside without adequate shelter or warmth, and had finally stopped moving when hypothermia and exhaustion had made continued travel impossible. What was most disturbing to the searchers was how close Thomas had been to home when he died. Less than half a mile in a straight line, a distance that would have taken 10 minutes to walk in good conditions. That was close enough that he might have been able to see his cabin if visibility had been better, or if he had been walking in the right direction. But the woods had refused to reveal their orientation. The snow had erased every track and every sign, and Thomas had died within shouting distance of safety, because he had not known which direction to shout or which direction to walk. Catherine was left a widow with 4 children, facing the remainder of winter without Thomas's hunting, providing meat and without his labor, providing the physical work that frontier homesteads required. The community supported her through the immediate crisis, but the long-term prospects for a woman alone with young children on an isolated homestead were difficult, and Catherine eventually made the decision to relocate to town where she could find work and where the children could receive education, and where survival did not depend on skills and physical capacity that she did not possess. Thomas Reed's death became a cautionary tale in the region, a story told to emphasize the importance of maintaining constant awareness of location during hunting, of recognizing when pursuit had extended too far and when turning back was wiser than continuing forward, and of understanding that tracks were temporary and that the snow that made tracking possible could also become the mechanism that erased the way home, leaving even experienced hunters lost in woods they thought they knew, wandering until exhaustion and cold completed their work. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark's most disorienting pursuits, a man who followed tracks deeper into falling snow than judgment allowed, who discovered that the same conditions that made pursuit possible could erase the way home, and who died less than half a mile from his cabin because the woods refused to reveal direction, and because the snow that had shown him where the deer had gone would not show him where he needed to go to survive. Thomas Reed followed the tracks until the snow erased them. Stands as a reminder that pursuit can carry us beyond the point where return is certain, that the excitement of following can override the awareness of location, and that the same snow that reveals where game has traveled can obscure where we have traveled until we are lost in woods we thought we knew, wandering in circles while home sits just beyond sight, unreachable not because of distance, but because direction itself has become uncertain, and every choice of which way to walk is equally likely to be wrong. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where tracks disappear and direction becomes uncertain, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between pursuit and loss, between following and being lost. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on when Thomas should have turned back, on whether you would have made the same choices, on what it means to be lost in familiar territory. And if this story resonated with you, helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate stories that remind us that the wilderness gives no second chances to those who push beyond the point of return. Until our next journey into territories where snow erases more than tracks, remember that somewhere in the Ozark woods, a man once followed a deer until he could no longer find his way home, and that he died within shouting distance of his cabin, lost not by miles but by direction, defeated not by distance, but by the snow that had shown him one path forward and then refused to show him any path back.